internally maintain and improve the quality of assessment. So this is about the steps that we take as an IQA when we are in that role to ensure how we can, standardize and consistently maintain the standards which we are upholding as an IQA. So if I take an example of how do we internally maintain, an IQA would be responsible for understanding the quality standards and the policies and procedures which are essentially laid out by awarding bodies. So one of the documents that I normally look at when we look at verifications and external examination visits, or we call them external assurance visits. What we want to be able to do is understand what are the standards that you need to be aware of as an IQA that you are going to maintain and uphold within the organization. Now, this learning outcome focuses on that because of the fact that you are aware of what the requirements are, and then you use those standards and requirements which are laid out, and then implement them within the organization. So if I just as an example show you, um, before we get into the specifics, but if I show you for every awarding organization that we work with, if you see my screen now, there is an external examination or an external assurance guidance document available from the awarding organization. In the case of universities, this could be documents like program review, which happens once in 3 years. In some places, they do once every year. It could be exam boards, and it could be external visits, which typically relate to either QA or, for example, inspection visits, which typically happen. Now, these documents essentially define what are requirements of the IQA and what standards IQA is required to maintain on behalf of the EQA within the organization. So when I talk about be able to internally maintain and improve the quality of assessment, what are you looking at improving and maintaining? The external standards which have been defined by the awarding organizations, or in some cases, the awarding institutions. That is what you need to have a very good understanding of. Now, as an IQA, if you have an understanding of that, then and only then you can use some of the instruments, which are the tools and techniques like policies, documents, which is this particular document. And there are these documents available for ATHE, for OTHM. We work with NCFE, and they are generally available as a document across the board for various qualifications. So when we run Pearson BTech at level 4, 5, 6, and 7, this is a document which applies for level 4 to 7. And every year, if there are changes which happen, they are published in this particular document. Now, this document acts as a guidance document for an IQA within the organization to understand how and what you need to familiarize yourself in terms of guidelines, quality standards, and how do you ensure the quality of assessments, which then are at some stage externally verified, and then leads to certification. Now, Pearson is a very good example because Pearson has essentially implemented the quality code into their qualifications. And when we look at their quality code, just as an example, some awarding bodies have, no policy or standards on resubmissions. But if you look at Ascentis, you look at Pearson, they would follow a quality code which is described by QA, wherein if a student is given assignment, they're allowed to get a formative feedback. And then once they get the formative feedback, they can make improvements. And when they do a submission, that is considered as a final submission. Now, if that final submission fails, then in the case of Pearson, you can award that unit by compensation, and they can still achieve the qualification at the end. But one unit is allowed to be not achieved or fail. But in most cases, what will happen is that if they fail that assignment, then there's a reset which is given. So there's a separate assignment which is called a reset assignment, and in that the marks are capped at pass. So this implementation of the quality code and in some qualifications is supposed to be understood by the IQA, because when you read this document, it gives you a very clear idea in terms of what you need to maintain and how you need to maintain this with the team of assessors that you're managing in your role as IQA. Now, this particular guide is a guide which is a useful guide, and I'm going to put this across on the Moodle today after the session. I'll include ATHE, I'll include OTHM, and I'll also include Pearson. And each of these documents, I think the Pearson document is the most brilliant, very detailed, but you look at documents from ATHE and OTHM, they are functional documents, a couple of pages, but they give you a gist of idea in terms of what you need to be maintaining and helping to improve with your assessors so that the quality of assessments are maintained and there are no objections which come through when the certification when you put work for sampling, and when it comes to certification the external examiners or external verifiers are not able to pick out any holes or pick out any gap areas or punch any holes essentially, and they agree with your decisions to uphold they uphold your decisions and obviously allow certification. So there is a bit that you need to look at in terms of planning. There is a bit in terms of you understanding the documentation. There is a bit in terms of you understanding the standards, how the report is written, what are the various parts of the report, and what inferences you need to get from that part of that report, which allows you to then implement and maintain those changes with the team of assessors that you have in your organization. So this is one example document that I've opened up. Now, the other part that we have to look at in this particular learning outcome is to also understand how do we give feedback. One is a feedback to the assessors, and then how do we standardize this feedback process so that it's not a one-off, but how do we standardize this process which allows us to then make sure that everybody is singing from the same songbook. So when we look at the process of feedback, there are lots of instruments that we use in terms of process of feedback. These instruments tend to be, teaching observations that we do in organizations. The best practice is also to look at peer observations, which is if I'm teaching, then my colleague who's also teaching the same qualification would also do my observation and give me peer feedback. But at some stage, the teaching observations which are done are basically playing a very major part in ensuring that the teaching and delivery is to a standard which ensures that the assignments, when they are received or when evidence or portfolio or evidence or portfolios are received from students, they are meeting the guidelines which have been set in the assignment brief. Now, you would also look at monitoring of outcomes. Very briefly, monitoring of outcomes can be done from external examiner reports, program reviews, exam boards. And if there are areas which are lacking or falling behind, then those are the monitoring that you need to do in terms of corrective action plans. So what we do is we use a word called CAP, which is corrective action plan. And those corrective action plans have to be created to ensure that we get back to the standard which is defined, and that would be by monitoring of outcomes. Then we look at obviously review cycles. This could be appraisals, which happen at the end of the year, but this could also be review cycles, which the IQA takes up with the assessors once a year or once in 6 months. And obviously, you look at their role in terms of assessments. You look at broadly sampling their assessments. You give them feedback throughout the year. And if you do feel that their assessments are slipping, are lenient, are borderline, are not meeting the standards, then there is feedback given commensurate to that, and then plan put in place with a set of activities to be able to help them reach that standard. And then one of the basic instruments that I've seen, which we have used, which universities use and all organizations use, is standardization meetings. And these standardization meetings are not meetings which are predominantly, as we run them, but sometimes what we have to do is we have to actually do the assessments and anonymize one or two assignments of different subject areas, send it across to all the assessors, let them assess. And then what we do is we look at whether the assessment is to a particular standard or not. Are some of your assessors, assessing too, let's say, aggressively, or they're being too harsh, or are they being too lenient? Or in some cases, what we need to be able to do is fine tune and find a balance that the assessments are not having any personal judgment in it, but they are using the guidelines which are given to assessors to be able to assess when they receive the receive the evidence in the form of assignments and portfolios from learners. So two assessment criteria, we will cover one, which will basically look at how IQA should give feedback to assessors and how this feedback should help in maintaining and improving the quality of assessments. So the feedback has to be developmental, has to be looked at from a point of view of activities which the assessors need to complete, and completion of those set of activities then helps them improve or come up to a particular standard which is required. And then how do you apply quality policies and procedures to standardize assessments? And that is where the role of the IQA is very important, is because the role of the IQA is to make sure that they declutter, de-filter the guidelines of the awarding organization and make sure that these guidelines are very clearly understood by the team of assessors that they manage. So in some cases, what you have to do is you have to very maybe outline and take into detail and explain the assessment criteria which are associated with the outcomes, how the assessment needs to be done, whether the assessment and the identification of that evidence is sufficient coverage for the LO, and in some cases, is it sufficient coverage for the unit? And if the qualifications are graded, then are these qualifications, are these decisions which are taken, excuse me, so are these decisions which are taken in respect of grading the unit and providing an overall grade consistent with the range of decisions that they are taking across identifying of assessment criteria in the LOs? And the decision when we look at assessing on the qualifications, when the assessors are doing on a graded qualification, their decisions on grading have to be very clearly communicated with students so that it does not lead to any sort of representation from the student that they are not happy with the grade or they think that they need to receive this grade. So the justification of evidence is what the IQA has to see when you do your sampling with regards to the work of assessors. And that is where you would see that the procedures to standardize assessment practice and its outcome are important, and they are the ones that we need to carry out in the standardization meetings. So again, here, when we look at discussing the assignment towards the end of the unit, what we are going to be looking at doing is putting in evidence, which is primarily going to be evidence of how IQA activity is carried out and what are the various documents or templates that we end up using that allow us to ensure and maintain the quality of assessment required for, say, an awarding organization or for for a course that you are looking at IQing. So if I briefly refresh, when we talk about the internal quality assurance process, and what we look at in the process is that role of the IQA is to ensure that the assessments done by assessors are fair and consistent. They are meeting and conforming to a particular standard. And when you look at making decisions on the assessments that they are fair and consistent, you also see a bit of reflection in terms of how teaching has been done or teaching and learning has happened for that particular unit or for that course. Because if the teaching and delivery in terms of that course has not been to a standard, then it'll have a cascading effect in terms of the assessments being submissions in terms of assessments being poor, and the decisions on assessments being reflecting that poor decision, which is borderline or lenient or not being able to justify why the learner's evidence meets the criteria. Now, one part, as we've covered in Learning Outcome 2, is that when we look at evaluating the quality of assessment, planning part of it is very important, and that is where the IQA planning cycle, which we covered in Learning Outcome 1, is important, because what you do is you define how this process would run throughout the year. So in our case at UK Versity and Courses for You, what you do generally see is, because we have rolling intakes, the IQA activity is pretty much continuous and ongoing. But in the case of other institutions and colleges or universities, you would normally see the IQ activity tends to be termly. That means there are 3 semesters in the year. So obviously this activity will happen typically towards the end of the semester. And that is where the major submissions of work or assignments tend to happen, which leads into assessment. And at some stage that assessment leads into the IQA sampling activity by the IQA. So it is a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. In most organizations, this is something which when we have an EQA coming in, the EQAs typically want to see evidence of where is the interim sampling which has been carried out by the IQA, where is the final sampling. Now, what they come in and do is they look at triangulation of evidence. They look at learner work. They want to see what activities which the IQA has carried out, and they want to see the standardization minutes or the minutes of the meeting which the IQA has carried out with the assessors. Now, in some cases, because student experience has become very important over the last few years, although it has always been important, but because of the TEF awards and other things which have been introduced, the HESA survey, what has happened is that the student experience has also become quite important. And that is where the EQAs sometimes also request the center that we want to speak to a few learners to take their feedback also to find out how they found the delivery of the qualification, or how they found the teaching and delivery, and obviously the assessment, and did they feel that they are confident in terms of achieving the qualification, or whatever feedback the students want to give. So it is sometimes seen as commenting in most reports that we get to see that they say that, okay, the IQA process is existence, but there is no further sorry, write-up, which is normally done by the EQA in the process. They all just mention it's compliant, the IQA process is compliant. But in some cases, when we look at, I would put it this way, in some cases, when we look at if there is sufficient evidence and the EQA feels very confident that there were no previous action plans, and obviously, the center is obviously looking and monitoring the reports and is ensuring that the feedback provided by the IQA to the assessors and from assessors to the student is timely. You would normally see this coming across as commenting on EQA reports. Now, I'm just going to stick to Pearson because I've given an example of Pearson. So if you see, this is our report for Pearson Center this year. Now, when she's done the sampling for 8 students on Pearson. And obviously, if you look at, she identifies very clearly that there are no previous, let's say, pending action plans. All registrations are up to date. And when you go into further detailing, sorry, she would mention in terms of areas of good practice. The assessor feedback is linked to learning outcomes, grading criteria. This is all a pat on the back for the IQA. There is in-depth feedback to the strengths and weaknesses of work and how the work could improve in future. Feedback to the learner is timely. There's feedback also on the learner work. Internal verification of assignments and learner work is thorough and timely. Now, behind this, she has seen a lot of documentation which has gone in. And that documentation is basically the management of academic standards, which the IQA does. So how do you ensure that the decisions are fair, the decisions are fair and consistent? There is an evidence to show that there is a decision-making process within the organization, and that comes in from policies which are there, like teaching and learning strategy or policy. You have the standardization policy, you have the malpractice policy, you have the assessor policy, you have the CPD plan for the organization or for the assessors, administrative support, minutes of the meeting which happen throughout the year. And then there are commentings done on each of these standards where the EQA looks at how I have come to this conclusion. So in some cases, the assignments and unit details were accurate, there were issue dates, there were resubmission dates given in the exam board, and obviously the assessments were varied. So we have not just had assessments in terms of the assignments, but there are PowerPoint presentations, there is recording required, which ensures that there are no ghost learners in the program, and it allows the learners to develop soft skills. So these are bits which are actually a pat on the back to the IQA, because if you see here, although she has written Philip Hodgkinson, and he's the quality nominee because that is how they address the report, but this is the report which reflects the work which IQA does in the organization. So all this that we talk about in terms of internally maintaining and improving the quality of assessments is basically a detailed part of it, which Pearson is a good example I can show. We have also examples of ATHE, we have also examples of OTHM, NCFE, and these reports are quite detailed. Now, this is the main part of the report, which is basically commenting on qualitative areas of how they see IQA process working within the organization. So the assessment processes are fair, the quality of teaching, the physical resources, the tutorial and pastoral support, opportunities given to students on feedback on the program, and obviously you also understanding the HN program, which is Higher National Programs guidelines, and taking into account that they are, for example, the access to the HN Global portal, which students need to have, the access to the HESA survey, which is the Higher Education Student Awareness Survey, which they have to participate in, is done. And there is a CPD program, which is linked to development of assessment processes and maybe in general, assessors within the organization. So all this is a part of, the IQA's work, specifically related to when I say the things that you have to maintain and assure within the organization. The second part of the report that you look at very briefly is the sampling report. Now, this sampling report, obviously, sampling, the EQA picks up the sample, the IQA is facilitating the sample, and obviously, once they do the sample, they are agreeing to most of the commenting and the feedback which has been given by the assessors. And in such cases, obviously, as you can see, even the EQA looks at detailed commenting where they need to justify why the student has achieved distinction or why the student's work is achieving a merit criteria. And as you can see, this report is quite a detailed report, and she has not refuted any grades which we have awarded because she has found enough justification in the assessor's assessment and the IQA's confirmation of that assessment, and that allows the certification for these learners to be received or released. Sorry. And this is the same case that we can look at for OTHM visits, for ATHE visits, and these tend to be, showing us very clearly that anything that we are doing in terms, when I say anything, I mean IQA is doing, is he or she is actually maintaining and upholding that standards which are required as per awarding body guidelines within the organization. So as you would see, it goes into details like staffing, but obviously if I go into details of internal quality assurance, these are the key areas that you are maintaining and improving. That is what we are required to cover in this learning outcome. So sampling plan is appropriate. Your sampling size is, when you choose the sample and do the sampling size is appropriate. It covers all the assessors. It covers if we have different sites, although we don't have different sites, but in our case, it will cover all the units, all the assessors, and the qualification. The IQA has full knowledge of the specifications which are required to be upheld, the standards, I would say, which are required to be upheld. There's a clear evidence of standardization meetings, which we obviously provide for every visit, and we do them quarterly. You have sampling plans which are shown and produced, and these sampling plans in detail allow the EQA to see that there were processes in place to provide feedback to the assessor if the work was not sufficient. In some cases, if the work was referred back, then the learner resubmitted that work, and the IQA has again done the IQA on that resubmitted work. You have records in terms of confirmation of evidence. That means it is accompanying the declaration of originality. The evidence which has been identified by the assessor is relevant, valid, current, and sufficient. Then, most important, the center is using, in this case, OTHM provides their own assignment briefs. So the IQA is responsible for ensuring that are the assignment briefs most up to date? Are they, being used? We are not using the older versions, or we are using the current versions. Rules of combinations are met. So if there are a combination of optional and mandatory units, and they've been defined in the program review or the program specification, they have been taken into account. And if I show an example of strategic management as an example, you would see there are 4 mandatory units and there are a number of optional units. So have the learners chosen the optional units in a way wherein the rules of combination, or ROC as we say, have been met? And then assessors have robustly applied. So one of the key roles of IQA is to also check whether the malpractice part of it has been identified or not. Have the assignments gone through a scan? Has AI been used to check whether the assignments have been written by AI? And those scans are to be made available when the sampling is done. And then obviously any certification which has been approved is approved basis the completion of work and completion of assessment. Now, sorry, this tends to be the role of IQA that you would generally see typically remains pretty much the same across the board when we look at different reports. So when we look at going back to our presentation and looking at a bit of coverage in terms of what this learning outcome talks about is this, which I've shown you visually. And what we are going to do is obviously now cover it by putting some more details by using the PowerPoint slides that I've created. So in terms of now, if you have to recall, because I've shown you practically what is maintaining and improving quality of assessment, these are the key things that we look at. They can come to let's say, points that we can summarize, which are the main points that allow us to say that, okay, if we are following these steps and these points are covered, then we are maintaining and improving the quality of assessment. So things like, is there an assessment cycle defined by the team of assessors? Are they following a particular cycle in terms of how the assessment is done, how timely the assessments are done? Have you approved the assignment briefs for release? Is there a release date? Is there a submission date? Is there some sort of plan put in place for sampling, whether it's interim plan or a final plan? Are there any assessors which are not meeting the guidelines? And is there a process that you have put in place to provide that constructive feedback to the assessors? And that is to be monitored, by the IQA to say, okay, your assessments are lenient or your assessments are borderline. But then you give some action plan to the assessor to say, we are going to monitor, and these are the activities which are going to be monitored. And then we will review whether you're meeting those standards. And that means some part of it is to look at putting the assessor into a bit of CPD plan, which is a number of activities that the assessor needs to complete to come up to that level. And then you're looking at obviously use of data, technology, and obviously engaging different stakeholders, which could be the quality manager, it could be the students, it could be the team of assessors, administrators in the college, and then working with them to ensure that these standards are, kept or they are maintained. Now, individual slides in order to explain what does this mean and what kind of activities can happen. In larger organizations, you could typically have regular audits which are done by head of compliance, and these could be continuous checks which are done quarterly. In some cases, when I look at universities, these checks are done in the form of program reviews and exam boards, and that typically tends to look at continuous monitoring. Now, when I look at providing constructive feedback, this tends to happen after, standardization meetings or one-on-one meetings or with teaching observations. And in some cases, what you would generally see is that these activities tend to follow, the activities which are related to teaching observations, peer observations, minutes of the meeting, and standardization. When we look at professional development for assessors, here you would look at they going on to attending workshops or training seminars, which typically happen with awarding bodies. So NCFE does, when you look at major organizations that we work with, they all have a training and planning calendar throughout the year. And our objective is to also send our staff across into attending some of these trainings related to the qualifications they deliver. And that tends to be giving them and keeping them up to date with the standards which are required to be maintained in the qualification. When we look at implementing improvement strategies, they could be a number of things which could originate from, external examination reports. It could be some sort of assessments and feedbacks that the IQA is doing with the assessors, trainee assessors, when you're developing them and you're giving them activities to complete so that they come up to the par in terms of meeting those standards. So, for example, if I see, I think last two terms, we've seen Daniel getting into the assessments of healthcare. and health and social care management. But what we initially felt that his feedback on the assessments was very brief. We also looked at Victor, and his feedback on the IT assessments that he does was very brief. One line, two line, achieved, well done, this and that. But obviously, that did not help, because when you look at doing assessments, the assessor is required to do three things. One, identify the assessment criteria. Second, justify the achievement. And third, second is to identify whether it's achieved or not. And the third is to justify the achievement, why it is achieved. Now, if you do not identify that as for the tasks or the assignments that you assess, then the IQA is required to give a developmental action plan or give one-on-one feedback to the assessors to say that this needs to be changed, this is what you need to correct, this is how you need to do it. And those set of activities then put the assessor into a bit of monitoring process for a couple of weeks and months to see how the assessments are improving. And those could be the action plans that typically are put in place, when we look at improvements. Now, in universities and large colleges, we have committees. You have academic committee, you have quality committee, you have student staff liaison committee, you have student committee, and all these committees are formed essentially to engage with stakeholders. So when we look at various stakeholders, these stakeholders are students, teachers, assessors, IQA, and in some cases, the administration staff. So they are a part of these committees, and these committees essentially look at analyzing and putting everything into one perspective, whether they are meeting and whether they're all meeting the aims and objectives set. And in such committees, what you have, what is called the terms of reference, TOR, as we call them. The TORs tend to define what the committee's role is. We have them in the Parliament. We have these committees which are headed by different MPs, and they even bring the Prime Minister in for questioning. And the role of these committees is to ensure that the standards are being maintained. The teaching is happening to what has been defined in the program. The progress is being attained basis what goals and objectives have been set. Assessments are timely. IQA process is timely, certifications are timely, and that is where the engagement of stakeholders typically tend to happen. Now, over the years, what has happened is that the technology has got integrated into most part of teaching and learning as well. And now, in order to maintain standards, because we have documentation and most awarding organizations essentially warrant that we need to store data for 3 years, 4 years. So what we are able to do is go into and do a bit of analysis to see trends. And this can be done through the use of technology. That means completion rates throughout the year, achievement rates throughout the year, grades throughout the year, how they are progressing. Now, if we have a cohort on law, and if the law students are only achieving a pass, then there could be some discussions which could be done with assessors and the teaching team to see how learners can be motivated, given feedback to be able to achieve merit grades. This is one of the plans that could be put into place. And in some cases, training might be required, delivery might need to be augmented. And in such cases, you would use technology. So looking at usage, looking at trends in terms of achievement rates, looking at trends in terms of completion rates, grades, and in terms generally how successful the students are in terms of completing qualifications can be done through the use of technology. And in various places, you have learner management systems, blackboards, Pro Monitor, various certain softwares available which allow you as an IQA to see those trends. Now, one of the things could be that, okay, we've got level 3 business students, which are in plenty numbers, but what we generally see is that most of these students are achieving only a pass. Now, this could be something which the IQA picks up and says, okay, why don't we have students achieving higher grades? And then you start going into details by doing a bit of analysis and use that analysis to come out with findings which could then be implemented as an action plan or maybe taken up in one of the meetings that you do. And that would allow you to improve standards, I would put it this way, for the purposes of improving grades, for example, across the cohorts that are studying. So this table summarizes the various set of activities that you as an IQA need to do, which we have covered in the slides, in order to help maintain and improve the quality of assessment. Any questions on this? Is this all understood?
Yes, go first.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now, when we look at the assessment criteria, here we are looking at a couple of things that I would put a bit more detail on, but which has been described in the slide. So, how do you provide feedback to assessors? As an IQA, what are the tools that you use to provide feedback to assessors? Any idea? How do you provide feedback to assessors?
You do your observations.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That is one of the routes.
Yeah.
Any other route that you can think of?
Sort of like, sorry, what was that?
One-on-one meetings.
Yes, one-on-one meetings. Okay. Or any other routes? So if we put on our thinking hats, all the points are correct. But you know what I want to do is basically look at starting with the very basics in terms of how this feedback process actually starts. So the first thing which the IQA does in terms of feedback process would be to look at the IQA report. And the IQA report essentially would be a detailed report which would essentially provide feedback to the assessors in terms of how they are, doing the marking, or how they are essentially, assessing the qualification. So in such cases, when you look at the feedback which we start as a process at the very initial beginning, would actually start with the assessments that you look at. And when you look at those assessments, what at some stage that you do is then provide a detailed IQA report. So if I show you a couple, on your screen from different awarding bodies that we work with, you would generally get to see that these are the kind of reports which typically are provided, as an IQA, and these reports actually constitute, feedback to the assessors. This is the first line of feedback or the first opportunity that you get to actually provide feedback to the assessors. There are different formats. Different organizations have different formats. So I've got one from Ascentis. This is they call it the moderation report, and it has a couple of things in it. So it will ask for number of learners, what grades have been achieved, pass, merit, or distinction. Then you have to do some commenting here, whether you agree with the assessment decisions. And then there are a number of other criterias which the IQA has to, let's say, comment on or agree on, yes and no. And then there is some areas which are provided wherein you can actually give some feedback. In the case of OTHM, if you see, again, they've got some criterias here. And on the right-hand side, you basically put qualitative comments to say, why do you think the assessment process is working and the assessor's feedback is accurate? You look at Pearson on this side, there are some commentings that you can do, and obviously you fill this up as a report. And similarly on ATHE. Now, in ATHE, it basically also in some cases, you would on these reports say, are there any further action plans, action points for assessors? Sorry, any action for assessors? Identify action points for assessors. So here is where you would obviously put some feedback in to the assessor to say that these are the areas for improvement. So when we go back into the presentation and when we look at how do we now look at giving feedback, to assessors, it starts with the IQA report. After the IQA report, you would go into teaching observations. In some organizations, as I mentioned, there would be what you call peer observations. You would have standardization meetings, and you would also have journal minutes of the meetings, which are typically done, throughout the year. The frequency varies on the size and scale of the organization, and that is what you would look at in terms of different activities that would be used as instruments that you do use to be able to provide feedback, advice, and developmental guidance to assessors to be able to maintain, uphold the quality of assessments that they are doing as far as the marking is concerned. So feedback sessions, these could be one-on-one feedback, as Reena said. It could be teaching observations, peer feedback. There could be a reflective practice at the end of it when the cohort achieves, how many have achieved, and how many learners have not achieved, or what is the grading which the learners have achieved. Observations could be typically observations which are coming across from the assessment cycles and from the IQA reviews that you do, evaluation of assessors' performance. This could be done on a one-on-one basis. This will also include performance reviews at the end of the year and also inclusion of some sort of activities which the assessors are then given, to look at CPD or development. And then when you look at future goals and objectives, there would be plans which are shared in terms of changes which are being introduced by awarding bodies and qualifications, like the T levels are coming in to replace level 3s in 2025-26. Most of it is going to become exam based. So these are bits that the IQs need to inform the team of assessors, and you're reading into the guidelines which are being introduced by awarding bodies to keep them up to date with any changes which are happening in specification of the programs or the delivery which will be required to be adapted for the purposes of teaching and learning. And these would be the bits that you would look at in the first assessment criteria, which is looking at providing assessors with feedback, advice, and support, and to ensure that they are meeting and conforming to the assessment processes as laid down by the awarding organization. Is that okay? Any questions on the first assessment criteria?
No, sir.
No.
Right. The second one basically talks about how do you apply the procedure of standardizing assessment practices and the outcomes. So here is what we need to think of if I put the thinking hat on, and if I look at what would be the areas that you as an IQA look at in terms of standardizing the assessments. So there are a couple of things that you can think of. Any ideas what comes to your mind when you talk about standardization of assessment practices? Any ideas? Anything that you have come across in our meetings which allow you to
Most likely what we can do for standardization is the same unit criteria and the same, the LOs are same to everybody, then in that case, the standardization automatically happens.
Correct. So that is one good point which has been said, is that yes, sometimes when you carry out these meetings and you do these standardization exercises, what you have to do is reiterate the main points which are defined in the qualifications or in the assignment briefs, which the assessors need to understand. So in a way, what you have to do is debrief the assessors to say, please follow the assessment guidelines given at the end of the assignment brief. Please follow them to be able to ensure that you are meeting and assessing to those standards. So one such example that we look at very briefly is the example of ATHE and OTHM and Pearson and some of the assignment briefs that we create. You would generally see that in the assignment briefs, what tends to happen is that it is very clearly defined that what is to be looked at from a point of view of evidence gathering for that particular unit. Now, if I again show that to you very briefly on the screen, just to give you an idea, this is one of the first parts that you end up doing when we look at applying the process of standardization across the assessments that the assessors do or marking the assessors do. So if I just open one or two of them, just to briefly show you, this is what we need to look at as a first step. So the IQA role in this case would be to ensure that the assessors understand the guidelines. So a simple example of OTHM is we need to make sure that they understand that the unit is not graded, pass and fail only. And when we go down to the details, it will give us a clear idea that delivery needs to be in the form of one report and a business plan. And that needs to be at least 2,500 words without TOC, table of contents, diagrams, references, and appendices. Now, if this is not something which has come out as an output, then the assignment needs to be returned back because the learner needs to put this into a particular format for them to be able to do so. In the case of ATHE, they have detailed assessor guidelines. So they leave no room for any sort of individual judgment which the assessors can put in. And that allows you to standardize, I would say, the assessments because it is very clearly defined in terms of what is required and what is required to be evidence, what is required to be checked as evidence in the learner evidence of work, which is assignment presentation, and that needs to be looked at in terms of assessment criteria, identification, and then justification to say this is the grade. You look at Pearson, we create the assignment briefs. We clearly mention in the submission format, this is what is required. We also mention details in terms of plagiarism, referencing. We provide what is a detailed scenario. And then towards the end, we also provide them the learning outcome and assessment criteria which they are hitting in order to be able to achieve that particular unit. So, in general, when we talk about learning outcome 2, and when we say how do we standardize the process in terms of ensuring that the assessment is fair, is consistent, is valid, and authentic, what the IQA role is to do is to ensure that the assessors understand the clear guidelines in terms of how they have to carry out the marking on the assignments. The marking on the assignments need to mirror what the requirements of the awarding bodies are. And in some cases, if they are new to the process of assessment, then obviously advice, guidance, and support needs to be provided, which could be done through teaching observations, which could be done through minutes of the meeting, could be done through standardization, could be done with them shadowing an experienced assessor, and also by asking them to complete certain activities which would give them the knowledge and information required to assess to a particular standard for that particular unit and or subject area or that qualification. So these tend to be 3 or 4 different instruments, which could be one-on-one feedback. It could be explaining and debriefing them on the requirements, which is done in the part of annual planning exercises that you do at the start of the term or the start of the qualification. And they tend to inform the assessors that this is what is required of them to be able to assess to a particular standard. And that is what I've listed here and a summary of that in terms of table. So one of the clear things that we do as an organization is once we've had the report, an external examination report, what we tend to do is basically discuss that report in the next meeting with all the assessors. What were the good points? What were the bad points? What are the areas that have been recommended as recommendations? What are the areas if we have got any action points? And those are required to be followed up by the IQA. So some of them get converted into what are called action plans. Some of them tend to be saying that, okay, we have maintained these standards. What we need to be able to do is maintain them further going forward. We've had a few recommendations, and these recommendations need to be, put into place to ensure that, we are not letting these standards actually slip. So an example of this, just to summarize our discussion today, is that it's not all good. So obviously, in the case of NCFE and functional skills, for example, we lost our DCS or direct claim status, and then we basically were given a lot of action plans, and these action plans were the responsibility of the IQA and the team of assessors to complete. So they were to ensure that there is consistency in terms of evidence of LOARs, which is learners achievement record. There was requirement to ensure that there is sufficiency in terms of written narrative when the speaking, listening, communication exam happens. There was also an action plan. Now, these are action plans on assessors, 3.5 and 6. 4.7 and 4.8, if we scroll down into the report, are basically action plans for the IQA to ensure LOARs are complete with sufficient learner examples. That means the narrative which was being written by the assessors was descriptive, was generic. It was not picking up details of why do you think the learner was able to hit the speaking, listening, communication exams and the guidelines, and why do you say it is a pass? And to ensure that all the assessment criterias were covered in the report. So in the SLC, the criterias include, there are 16 criterias, 2.1 to 2.19. So the assessors were required to judge each and every criteria, and that is something which the IQA should have picked up. But there were only 7 or 8 criteria, and that is where these things were pointed out as action points in both the assessment and the quality assurance section, which is IQA section. And in this report, we were able to achieve them. So as you can see, they're all achieved now. But if I show you a previous report, it was basically not within tolerance, which is 3 is also acceptable, but anything in 4, 5, and 6, in some cases, if it goes, then you are given action points to improve on those processes. And as a result, what happens is you lose your direct claim status. So these were all achieved because We put a corrective action plan in place. That corrective action plan essentially allowed, the IQA to run those set of activities, with the assessors and the team of assessors, and that allowed us to show an evidence. This is the corrective action plan, as you can see. So there were a couple of points which were picked up, like 3.2, 3.5, 3.5 for assessment. There were a couple of them for IQA, and these were all then picked up, and we put activities into place, steps taken to ensure that we are able to correct and maintain the standards as required by NCFE, and that has allowed us to get to a stage wherein we have reached again a standard which is required of the DCS, but still don't have the DCS. There will be another visit on the 8th of August, and that visit on the 8th of August would hopefully confer us back the DCS to say now you're meeting the standards, and we'll monitor this for a year. And after the year, they will do another visit to say, okay, whether you're meeting those standards or not meeting those standards. So this part falls in as a role of the IQA. And this part of the role of IQA allows you to apply the procedures which are required to ensure that there is a standardization and basically standards are maintained. It's a word that I'm overusing today, but what you're trying to do is making sure what the awarding body wants, what the learner work is marked on, is meeting the criteria which the awarding body is asking for. And that is what the IQA role is, and that is how you do it. So one of the instruments that you do it through is by looking at external quality assurance reports, picking up recommendations, action points from there, and then feeding them back to the assessors in the standardization meetings, in the minutes of the meeting. And in some cases, if we do feel that one of the assessors' work has let us down, or a few of the assessors' work has let us down in terms of losing the claim status, then in such cases, what you're looking at doing is ensuring that that specific assessor is given that feedback and guidance to be able to come up to a standard which allows us to, maintain the requirements from the awarding organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
Oh, that's okay.
So good stuff. So we'll meet up next week to cover Learning Outcome 4. But what I'm going to do is, as a part of the discussion that we've done today, I'll upload one or two, the IQ reports, one or two external assurance guidance documents from Pearson, ATHE, and OTHM, so that you have an idea in terms of what is required when we talk about Learning Outcome 3 in terms of be able to maintain and monitor. So we are not bringing things into the foray ourselves. What we are looking at is understanding the guidance which has been already published by the awarding organizations that we work with, and we are just implementing and debriefing the team of assessors and then implementing along with the assessors those guidelines to be able to maintain and improve the standards within the organization for the qualification. Good stuff. So thank you so much for joining in today, and I will see you next week. Updated versions of this would be on Moodle, and then if you have any questions at any given stage, hopefully you can drop me an email and I can provide more information related to some of the reports, which obviously are internal, but obviously we can share them with you for the purposes of reading and at some stage using as annexures in the assignment later. So that is the end of today's session. Thank you so much.